So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Justice Through Storytelling. I'm going to share my screen. My name is Dawn Frisby Byers. I'm the Senior Director of Content and Engagement for the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. The Pennsylvania Humanities Council is an independent 501(c) partner of the National Endowment of Humanities. We're one of 56 state and territory councils dedicated to the promotion and the practice of the humanities. Our mission is to put the humanities in action and to create a positive change in the lives of people and communities throughout the state. We focus on education, community development and engagement, and advocacy. Today, we're going to hear from 4 experts in the field, and I'm proud to call them all PhD partners and have had the opportunity to work with all of them. Ulysses is the project director for our Chester Made initiative in Chester, Pennsylvania. Daniel Egusquiza is the executive director of Barrio, Alegría, a community organization in Reading, Pennsylvania. Lindsay Varner is the community outreach director at the Cumberland County Historical Society in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Julie Donofrio is the managing director at PennPraxis, which has conducted a national research on the importance and the impact of storytelling. To help us frame this conversation, Julie is going to start by giving us an overview of the PennPraxis research. Then we'll hear from Daniel, who will give examples of his work using storytelling in immigrant communities to foster belonging. Lindsay will show how the Cumberland County Historical Society used storytelling to collect and honor untold history. And Ulysses will present the use of storytelling to change perceived narratives of a community. Then I will moderate a discussion on the power of stories and why they matter. Please note that the Q&A function is enabled, so feel free to type in a question for any of the panelists, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the allotted time. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Julie, you're up.
Thank you, Dawn, for setting that up. And now I will share my screen. Can everyone see? Good. Okay. So hello, everyone. Today, my name is Julie Donofrio, and as Dawn said, I'm the managing director of PennPraxis. PennPraxis is a part of the University of Pennsylvania. We're housed within the School of Design, which is the School of Architecture, Urban Planning, Landscape Architecture, Historic Preservation, and Fine Arts. So there are many intersections with some of the work that we'll discuss today, but our role is to do projects of practice with the community, and also to extend the knowledge of the school and connect it with things that are happening in the world of practice. So because of that, we were approached by PHC to do an evaluation of some of their work from a third-party perspective. And this was a really interesting project for us because the humanities are not often something that we work on as called as such. But what was interesting in the in the research and the things that we uncovered is that there is so much that the humanities bring to a lot of work that people like myself, who's trained as an urban planner, do. You know, we always are trying to work with communities about, you know, neighborhood revitalization, social justice, you know, how to make improve quality of life. And you know, as the years have gone on, it's become a lot more community-based and nuanced. So, you know, this was such an interesting and incredible project for us, and we're really happy to share it with you today. So just starting briefly, there we go. So I will try to do this as quickly as possible. There's a long paper associated with this that hopefully we'll be able to share soon. But basically, we'll just talk about the objectives of the project, a quick findings overview, and a call to action. So the objectives of the project were to try to uncover what the humanities role is in community development. And in order to do that, we looked at case studies from Pennsylvania, of course, because we're talking about the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, but we also wanted to see what was happening nationwide and to really, you know, talk about diverse audiences. So every organization that we looked at has a different group that they are currently representing or trying to serve. And in particular, we wanted to highlight grassroots organizations. So a lot of the groups that may or may not be known as the humanities now are, you know, museums or libraries or things like that. And we really wanted to go deeper and to find, like, who are some non-traditional hosts of this type of work. And so after a fair amount of digging, we pulled together these groups, which were both from the East and West Coast and some in the Midwest, and tried to pull out, you know, people who already work with PHC, but some completely new groups that were working with, you know, immigrant communities, Latinx communities, queer communities, and others. So just that we had a broad perspective of all the different types of groups for which the humanities and storytelling in particular is being utilized. So first, we have a couple different sections here in the presentation, but really our first question is, you know, defining the humanities and how are they being deployed in this space of community development. And the first of that is storytelling, you know, hence the title of this program, because it is first and foremost the thing that binds all of these groups together. Almost everyone uses storytelling as a way to build power, conversation, and through that, social justice, because, you know, people are identifying commonalities, they're coming together, and they're building power from within. Secondly, excuse me, identity and other terms is another a thing in which all of the humanities groups, or these groups that were employing the humanities, talked about, is because all of it is about seeing, you know, and uncovering shared experiences, and how does that bind folks together in order to be lifted up and to accomplish bigger and greater things. We caveat by saying that and other terms, because identity itself as a word might be a little too narrow in terms of defining the ways in which humans can come together and find commonality in order to move forward. And then thirdly is creating empathy and understanding. And so a lot of the humanities work is to say, you know, maybe we are different, or maybe we have very different lived experiences, but in order to have, you know, positive momentum, shared goals, is to really just appreciate where other people are coming from, and, you know, say, you know, here are some, you know, this example from Fresno is, you know, here are some recipes from the Syrian population of this incredibly diverse part of the Central Valley of California, to say, you know, this is what we have to contribute, but we've also had a lot of hardships too. So how is this creating a powerful exchange in order to move forward? So what I just presented are the things that all of these groups already actively do. These are, you know, tried and true themes and things that are, you know, cemented as what we do. But there's also these aspirational things, and that's the section that I'm going to go into next. So what are we already testing the waters of, but really need to do more? So first of that is leadership development. So within using storytelling towards justice, we're not just saying, we need to come together and share histories and stories, what is this ultimately leading to? And what that is trying to create new leadership. As many people are certainly aware, the leadership structure in this country and others is pretty, it's non-diverse, and there's a lot of room for growth and for diversification of that leadership. So, but where does that begin? So what a lot of these groups are doing under the umbrella of the humanities is to build power from within, recognizing the power that already exists, and trying to really build that social and human capital so that people can start moving towards self-determination. Next is the theme of transformation. So we mean this in several different ways. How are we transforming places to be different than how they were? Or, we're bringing in different people to transform them together to something completely new. Or how are we transforming organizations in the way that they are led? Who are their leaders? Who are their members? And then also, how is funding being set up? So is funding only being available to folks who can write an extremely lengthy grant application? Or are organizations starting to, funders transforming the way in which they fund so that they're able to bring more people into the conversation? So this is something that, right here in Philadelphia, hearing from LISC, this is something that they're trying to do, is just change the entire way that we do grants and that we are able to fund work such as these humanities-based groups. So decentering the expert and involving non-traditional actors, this is something that that is also, a pretty far along theme. A lot of people talk about who's the expert in conversations, especially when you talk about community engagement, but it really needs more work, involving non-traditional actors such as artists, other members of the community, rather than just, the typical histories that have already been shared. Lindsay Varner here is quoted, and you'll hear from her later, but, really, like, how are we just lifting up more narratives and more stories to be able to tell the history of the neighborhoods in which we serve? So healing-centered practices is another thing. A terminology that probably a lot of people are familiar with is trauma-informed. And that is something that's become a little bit of a moniker about, how to do community development and engagement in a space where we know that deep traumas have existed. But, the way we framed it here, with PHC's help is talking about healing, and how are we, basing forward momentum and seeking justice through not just, speaking about things that have happened in the past, but how are we moving forward? And I think we're seeing a lot of that today with what's happening in the world. And all this is done through storytelling, so it's, it's the therapy required to talk about, difficult histories, but it's also, what are the positive histories and how are we, using that to move forward and build strength? Really important to all this work is changing the narrative. So a lot of places that are doing social justice and trying to, revitalize their communities, however you define that, when done from the perspective of grassroots organizations, it really is about saying, this isn't the neighborhood you thought it was. This is a neighborhood full of pride and history and diversity and all of these wonderful communities. And so that really is a lot of the work of these grassroots organizations, is to change the narrative both from within, that we, the people who live here, have pride in our lives and in our lived experience, but also to people who may not be part of that community, to say that there's so much of value here. And that work really needs to go on in order to, deal with the vast challenges that we have in terms of achieving justice, both place-based and, around certain communities. So moving forward, so what are the current realities? And another way of saying this is, what are the challenges? This might sound like, oh yes, this makes a lot of sense, but there are definitely challenges that are making this work a little difficult. now, and part of our evaluation work is saying, well, how can we put more of this work into the hands of more? So, the humanities, as I described before, is, you might think of, theater or poetry, but it could fund so much more. It could fund all of the storytelling work that we're just discovering, and PHC has been an incredible leader in that. So we really need to identify that the way the humanities may be funded could be expanded. There's also the incredibly important idea of cultural sensitivity. And so, how are the people who are able to raise money and the communities in which they work, how are all of these people able to be at the same table to talk about, with philanthropy, how can we leverage public and private dollars to really, help the communities that need them, but what is the conversation that needs to happen in order to bring those communities together? There are significant divides in that and a lot of work to be done. Of course, trust building is related to all of these, themes that I've already talked about, and then enough resources for sharing, media, and amplification of these stories. And so finally, I'll just leave everyone with this call to action, which is, what do we need to be doing more of in this space? So we need to be, saying storytelling is the way to achieve a lot of these goals. So we need to be able to support that. We need to be able to find more funding sources. We need to, say that this is a tried and true way of achieving social justice. We need to invest in long-term commitments to place. We need to invest in new leaders. This is related to the leadership development things I discussed. We need to talk more about transformation. We need to build power through exchange and call it as such. And we need to acknowledge trauma, but also prioritize healing. So all of these were themes that we pulled out of the great work that are, some of the speakers that you'll hear after me are already doing. So, this is really just, like a barn raising to say, this work is amazing. How can we get more support for this type of work through community development, through the humanities, and basically come together with some shared visions. So that is the conclusion to my portion of the framing. Hopefully that was helpful. And
thank you,
yeah.
Julie, thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah.
We're now going to hear some concrete examples of storytelling in communities. I'm going to start with Daniel, who is from Barrio, Alegría in Reading. So Daniel, if you're ready.
Yep, I am ready, and I am going to share my screen with you guys. Give me a second. Okay, and here we go. All right, so you should be able to see right now a picture from some of the people that are part of the Storytelling Through Dance program. Barrio Alegría is a community engagement organization. It's an organization that utilizes art to create transformational moments in individuals in order to incite them to transform their community. We are located in Reading, which is a city of 80,000 people, 40% of which live under poverty levels, and 60% of which are Latinos. And I want to start with asking you some questions. If I told you that you are bad every 5 minutes for a whole hour, you would probably resist it and push back. If I told you you're bad every half hour for a whole day, you might start to have doubts, but you would still push back. If I told you you're bad every day for a month, would it be so easy to push back? Or would the doubts become certainty? Imagine being told you're bad daily for 10, 18 years. You'll probably end up believing it. And once we internalize those beliefs, once we internalize those narratives, how do we change them? How do we get them out? So stories are important, but I'm going to tell you a story that will illustrate exactly how important they are here in Reading. One of the things that we do is creative placemaking. And we have a designated area of our city that is geographically in the south side of our city. We organize cleanups, we do movie nights, art projects, etc. Neighbors have very slowly started to trust us, and we have started to get comfortable talking to us about their issues. But then the pandemic hit, and we were ordered to quarantine, and we ceased all projects and stopped our presence in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, our program sites, which are abandoned lots, disinvested parks, and bodega fronts, were taken over by a group of drug dealers who seized the opportunity to sell blatantly during the pandemic. But once PA went into the yellow phase, we started having events slowly with a couple of cleanups and art programs here and there. One day, while we were celebrating one of the particular cleanups, I got a call from one of the neighbors, and they called me in tears. And she said, "Daniel, I was just threatened in the street. They said they're going to jump me because they believe that I've been calling the police and getting activities here in the neighborhood. Can we please have more activities? Can we have an activity tomorrow so that they know that it's not just me doing them?" And this happened during the time when there were some memes that were going around that were becoming very popular about the importance of art. And when something like this, you should be thankful for the arts, because as you are sitting on your couch, as you're watching movies, TV shows, and podcasts, the arts are here to entertain you. And I thought, man, what a divide. On the one hand, we have some folks who are able to utilize the arts as a distraction, but in the south side of Reading, the arts are a matter of life and death. And we started a crusade because we believe that we need to change the narrative about the work we are doing, be it through the arts or the humanities, because this neighbor's first call was not to City Hall or the police. It was to a storytelling organization, and a pretty small one at that. And it became obvious that we needed to do a better job to change the narrative that what we do is not only important, but vital. So my thesis for this presentation has 3 points that we have learned over the past 5 years. One is that stories can build power or disavow it, that stories create sanctuaries for people, and that stories are catalysts for change. And all of these points, I tried to find the best story that could illustrate all of these points. And it's on a true story that happened to us last year. Barrio was invited to be part of a book that was going to highlight Latino organizations or people who were doing great things in the community, namely Latino. The book was being written by a local university's writing department, and the teacher had done this before. She had found stories of the first Latino families that had migrated to Reading and had published a book about them. The book became very successful, and the descendants of the families had lauded the professor. This book had been written 10 years ago. However, last year, the professor found a different crowd of Latino people in Barrio. On our first meeting, when the professor explained the project, we raised our first flag. The professor had said that the students were not from the city. And we wanted our story to be written by a student who came from our community. When the negotiations broke down and we threatened to pull out, we got pushback, not only from that professor, but from some of the other organizations and individuals who said, but Daniel, this is good for us. They are telling our story. Who cares who writes it? It's going to be an honor. And the solution came. The second meeting, the professor told us that two students from writing had signed up for the class, and one of them would be writing our story. But on the first class, when it was time for us to meet our student, we were told that 2 other students had withdrawn from the class. As a result, the professor said we had to remove 2 of the organizations from the book. Who? Only the story of the first Latina councilwoman and business owner of one of the most successful small businesses in the city, and the story of one of the only Latino members of the LGBT community in our city. Of course, we pulled out of the project because one of our beliefs is that what happens to one of us happens to all of us, and also because we wanted to hold institutions of power accountable to their work. The university had a good idea. It wanted to build power, but in the process, it had denied it. It had the intention to build a safe space, but in my opinion, did not have the capacity to see the bigger struggle for equality in our communities. And in the end, in my opinion, it failed to create change. The book was published, but I saw very little change for those whose stories made it into the book. But as I finish, I want to go back to the beginning, because I think it is extremely important for cities like Reading to find out what we can do once a narrative has been internalized. How do we change that? So far, we believe in the journey. We believe that the process is the solution. And it is our experience that this is going to take an investment of time, of trust building, and the understanding that as hard as it may be, we might not be able to see the change in our lifetime. And that's my presentation. I'm going to stop the sharing now.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. That was fantastic. If you stop sharing, we're going to go with Lindsay. And Lindsay's going to talk about the Cumberland County Historical Society and the use of storytelling on an important project.
All right, thank you, everybody. So I had started out with the Cumberland County Historical Society as the Heart and Soul Project Director, and the Greater Carlisle area was selected as one of 3 pilot projects with the Pennsylvania Humanities Council's partnership with the Orton Family Foundation out of Vermont. And we were implementing a storytelling project called Community Heart and Soul. And the idea behind the project was you were going to collect stories from the community. And going into the project, you had absolutely no idea what the stories were going to tell you about the community. There were no preconceived notions. There was really no idea of what could come out of these stories for the community. So we started asking around, who should we be talking to? Where should we start? This is going to be a 2 to 3 year project, and we want to try and get information and input from as many people within the community as we possibly can. And we started to hear from community members in our area that we really needed to be reaching out to some of our more rural communities and to some of the most underrepresented populations within the community to ensure that their voices were being heard and that they were actively participating within the Heart and Soul process. And as we started to build our team, we had a borough council member who's in the center here, Pam Still, of this photo, and she was really keen on getting her borough, Mount Holly Springs, involved in this storytelling process. So keen that before we even started working with PHC, she was at the meeting for Heart and Soul, and she started gathering stories ahead of the project starting that she could then hand over to the project because she saw the value of Heart and Soul for the community. And over the course of her storytelling, she was trying to collect a story from the Gumbies, the two sisters you see on either side of her, Harriet and Edna. And she really struggled initially to get a story from them. She had tried to call them. She had stopped by their house at one point, and she was just unable to get a story. And she came to me once I was hired as the project director and said, everybody tells me we have to talk to the Gumbies, but I can't get them to sit down and talk to me. And I think the story of the Gumbies is very emblematic of a lot of the stories that we started to collect within the greater Carlisle area, but then also within the whole of Cumberland County, in that there was very little trust that Harriet and Edna had in this random borough councilwoman knocking on their door asking if she can sit down and interview them. But then it also took the community to convince them essentially to sit down with Pam. Pam went to the pharmacist in Mount Holly and said, I'm trying to talk to the Gumbies, can you vouch for me? Harriet went in and the pharmacist said, hey, Pam's a great person. She really just wants to get to know you for this project and see if you could get involved. And eventually Harriet reaches out to Pam and says, all right, let's talk. And we sat down in their living room 3 times before we were able to record their story. And all 3 times she started telling us the story about the church behind her house, where she grew up, what it was like living in Mount Holly Springs, when she left to go get work. And towards the end of this hour and 15-minute interview, she talks about her grandfather, who had been enslaved in Hagerstown, Maryland. He fought in the Civil War as a member of the United States Colored Troops, the USCT. And after the war, he came to Mount Holly Springs, built a house very close to the house we were sitting in where they were telling us the story, and helped to build the church that sat behind their house. And you can see in the very bottom right-hand corner, the church was completely overgrown. From their back garden, you couldn't even see that there was a structure there. There was so much poison ivy and trees. And in many ways that protected it. And if you would look in the window, everything was still inside this church. Pews, there were hymnals still open. There was an organ, a piano. They've essentially, the congregation shut the door in the 1970s and just walked away. But the Gumbies were continuously keeping an eye on it. And they were trying to honor the memory of their family through this church by putting up some no trespassing signs, a lock on the door so people couldn't get in. Apparently it was a very popular party place in the 90s for teenagers. We have a few stories of that actually, of his remembering partying in there. But the story really started to get us thinking about the histories that we haven't collected. So Harriet's story was incredible. We had very few stories of community members across Cumberland County where they talked about their ancestors and their service in the Civil War, or even the African-American churches within the whole of Cumberland County. So we started to look into this site, and within the Historical Society itself, there was absolutely no record of this site as a historic place. It wasn't recognized in the county's comprehensive plan as a historic structure. It is the only known log African-American church that we know of in this region, in the central Pennsylvania region. And yet nobody knew anything about it. The chief of police, when we told him about it and asked for once we started to go talk publicly about the sites, we asked the officers to drive past every once in a while. He thought it was a chicken coop for years. He didn't even look inside to see that it was this amazing church. And what was so incredible, we collected this story in May of 2016. And by the end of 2016, we just started to have a series of coincidences that started to take place that all centered around the church. I had a family reach out to me that was looking for their ancestor through genealogy research. And it happened to be that their ancestor was Henry Ward, who was buried at the Mount Tabor Cemetery and had been one of the original congregants that established Mount Tabor Church back in 1878. And we brought them to Carlisle. We collected their family story. We introduced them to the Gumbies, who it turns out they're distant cousins and didn't even realize they were distant cousins. And they started working directly with the community to preserve and save the church. And one of the most amazing things about the Ward family is they have a trucking company. So when we said we wanted to get all of the contents of the church outside of the building in case the roof collapsed when we took some of the trees down, they brought a storage trailer, set it beside the church, and we had a community day in which we got everything outside of the church. And slowly we started to see stories of community members coming forward of their memories of either attending the church or remembering when the church was in use. And this whole group of individuals are now working towards the preservation of this church, all starting from one story and then working their way through to share their story. And now, as you can see from the pictures, they're climbing roofs and securing the tin roof that's right there. We've had archaeologists down doing dendrochronology on the logs to see how old they are. Dickinson College in Carlisle did ground penetrating radar, so we would know how many people are actually buried in the cemetery. And all of this started with a single story. And it has now led to the creation of a nonprofit. Mount Tabor Preservation Project is now leading the charge to save this church. But I think one of the most important things that really came out of Harriet sharing her story was this realization that the Historical Society and our community much more broadly has not done a very good job of capturing everybody's history and everybody's story. And we really had to reflect within our own organization at whose story we've been capturing and coming to terms with the reasons why we haven't been telling a complete historical narrative. And that has led to a series of conversations within our organization, but then also within the community, looking at our institution's difficult history and basically talking to other community members and other community organizations and working with them as they explore their own difficult history and the impact that that has had on the narrative that we tell in the county. And it's led to this incredible project at another site in downtown Carlisle called, it's Lincoln Cemetery, but it's technically Memorial Park. In the 1970s. They took a railroad property and then the cemetery that was there and turned it all into one large park. And buried on this site are over 600 African Americans. It was the segregated cemetery for Carlisle. The earliest date we have is 1805, but it could have been earlier to about 1905. And about 675 individuals are buried on this site. And thanks to an arts grant from Pennsylvania Humanities Council and the PA Council of the Arts, we've been doing some community projects to start to recognize this site for what it is, which is a cemetery. They did not remove any of the bodies from this site, so it is still hallowed ground. And coming to terms with this history is probably one of the most important things that we feel we could be doing within our community, but then also engaging the descendants of those who are buried there. So really the descendants have been leading this project, and then they've been working with us every step of the way to help us figure out how to memorialize this site for their ancestors. So we are currently in the midst of this project. The first thing that we did was take the names of those that we know who are buried there, write them on these strips of fabric and hang them around the fence to start to get the community thinking about this space as hallowed ground, so that when the memorial takes place, the community can really come to terms with this site and the history of this site. And so this is a continuously project. It's always ongoing as we start to rewrite the historical narrative. It's not going to be something that happens overnight. It is going to take a lot of time to rebuild trust, but then also to start looking at the research that needs done. By not collecting a lot of the things that histories over the years, it basically means that we don't have a lot to go off of in terms of research. And we've been very open about the fact in the past few years that as much as we want to incorporate different historical narratives into our histories, if we're not collecting it, then where is it going? And how do you start to tell those stories? So we first have to start having those conversations so that we can start gathering those histories to create a more inclusive narrative. So I will leave it there and hand it back over to Dawn.
Lindsay, thank you so much. That's fascinating. I know about the project, and I am always learn more when I hear you talk about it. We're going to close the initial presentations with Ulysses Slaughter from Chester, Maine. Ulysses is going to talk about that project in Chester, Pennsylvania. Ulysses?
Thank you, Dawn. Let's see. Hello, everyone. I am going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to jump around a little bit with my presentation. It's called Chester Stories: Using Storytelling to Change the Narrative. So one of the things that I find to be quite interesting is every time I hear people talking about changing the narrative, I have to ask myself, for who and for what are we trying to change the narrative? I want to throw out a quote that I really like. It comes from Frantz Fanon, who wrote a number of books, but one of his books is called The Wretched of the Earth. And in that, and in his lifetime, he made the statement, he said, every generation must, out of relative obscurity, define, fulfill, or betray its mission. I'm gonna repeat that. Every generation must, out of relative obscurity, define, fulfill, or betray its mission. This is important because I think the mission is always connected directly with a storyline. One of the things about narratives is that they are not stagnant. Narratives come from history into the present, and like waves, they flow into the future. So there's nothing stagnant about a narrative. And narratives, thankfully, are dynamic, and they are also parallel, which is a struggle. So I want to talk some about the city of Chester. I've been around Chester for almost 30 years now. I'm originally from Chicago. I came into Chester as a journalist, wound up moving there, having children there, becoming part of the Chester landscape. And I think it's important to talk about one's place in the city where you're talking about the narrative, and who are you in that location where you are talking about the narrative. There are times where I've talked to people in the city of Chester. And for those of you who don't know, Chester is about 15 miles southwest of Philadelphia. It is said to be the oldest city in Pennsylvania. I'm going to jump up on one of my slides here. One of the oldest cities in Pennsylvania. Got something here that says originally settled in 1644. Gives you some other information about William Penn. But just as I'm looking at this note right here, I think about the Lenape, the people who were here before William Penn. And so this narrative thing, this storytelling thing becomes very interesting depending on where you start. You can start talking about William Penn as if he founded something. We all know how people find stuff, like it wasn't there before they got there, and it becomes part of the story. And so there were people here before he got there, and learning how to reconcile these parallel histories as we're talking about dealing with narratives is extremely important. The Pennsylvania Humanities Council came into Chester somewhere around 2015 and started doing some work. And one of the first things that they started to do with a good friend of mine, Devin Walls, and the people who headed up Chester May was they started working on stories, because stories are instructional. Stories are the directions about how to move forward. Stories are the things that tell you where you came from. Stories are the things that tell you where you are. And if you got, as I heard I forgot the gentleman who went before me, but when he was talking about if you tell somebody something over and over and over again, they begin to believe it. And so this narrative thing, changing the narrative, becomes crucial. And Chester has been told so many things. Chester as a whole has been told so many things about what it is and what it has been, that it's not surprising that some people say that Chester suffers from an identity crisis. So I want to talk about justice also, because justice is not stagnant. People talk about justice as if it's something that can be achieved ultimately, and that's that. Justice is not stagnant. It's something that you have to fight for constantly. It's an ongoing struggle, which is why they call it a struggle. And it's not an abstraction either. I think justice is extremely intimate. It's something that people can and should be able to feel, and not just be talking about social justice. If you don't have people who can actually experience it and can tell you what it is, it probably doesn't exist. And so social justice is viewed best through the examples of individuals who can tell you what their fight was all about, that brought them to the need to fight for this thing that we call justice. So I want to pull up this piece, and I want to invite people who are still tuned in here with us, if you're there, I want to invite you to answer this question. What happens when the lion tells the gazelle story? Or answer this question. When a powerful group imposes a story on a group with less power, you finish the sentence. You can put it in the chat if you'd like to. When a powerful group imposes a story on a group with less power, again, you finish that sentence. What happens when a powerful group imposes a story on a less powerful group? So here's my friend, the lion. Let's say the lion was writing a headline or the story of the gazelle. The lion might say something like, the gazelle ran, so I chased it, right? The lion might say, the gazelle jumped down my throat. The lion might say, the gazelle was teasing me, so I ate it. And then finally, the gazelle might say something like, the lion might say something like this: that gazelle gave me indigestion. So in the end, the lion just keeps telling these stories that totally dismisses the fact that the gazelle had its own reality and actually had its own story to tell. And that's what happens in a lot of our communities, is that we totally forget that there are multiple players and multiple interests in these communities like Chester. And if there's a powerful group of people, a powerful media, more powerful storytellers, they will use their power to tell you what's going on. And that's what's been going on in the city of Chester for a long time. Again, for those of you that didn't know it, Chester is said to be the first city of Pennsylvania. For those of you who didn't know it, it's the place where Martin Luther King studied at the Crozier Theological Seminary from 1941 to 1951. A lot of people didn't know that Martin Luther King studied in the city of Chester at Crozier Theological Seminary, spent time at Calvary Baptist Church. A lot of people didn't know that the thing that they call the hoagie was discovered in the city of Chester. A lot of people don't know that the oldest public building in continuous use, the courthouse, is in the city of Chester. So Chester has a lot of first, but a lot of the times it's not that stuff that makes it to the people outside of Chester. What they get are the headlines around the violence, the poverty, the lack of education. They always get all of the lack. So as I'm looking at this screen that I have up, I want to talk about how power and authority is important to amplification and sustainability of the narrative. Power and authority. And that authority sometimes it can actually be illegitimate, but authority and power are authority and power. If you got the power, might makes right, they used to say, and it's still true today. A lot of the times people will impose a narrative, and that's what happens a lot of times in Chester. I want to go to the next slide. So Chester Made came into being around 2015. And one of the first most important things that happened was that, again, they began to tell stories. The people who are on this now wave of Chester are telling a story about the past that will inform the future. The people who are on the now wave, again, narratives happen in waves. The ones that are on the now wave are talking about what happened, what's going on, and how that's going to inform the future. When you can tell a story and amplify, reproduce that story, and it can be pushed out to the world around you, that's power. And that's what Chester Made is attempting to do every single day, because again, it's an ongoing process. One of the things that's important about the narrative, just like, and I'm interchanging the term narrative with story, they're essentially the same thing, is that stories have elements. Now, when I look up the elements of a story, depending on where you look, you see that stories can have 5 elements, 7 elements, 10 elements. They just got elements. But what's true of most stories is that they're characters, their setting, there's conflict, there's place, there's resolution. All right. Chester has competing narratives even within the city. Outside of the city, people are looking at Chester and saying, again, it's dirty. It used to be the powerhouse. It used to be that place where Sun Shipyard built all of their ships. It used to be that place where Baldwin Locomotive made trains. It used to be that place where Forward Motor Company was on the waterfront. It used to be that place. Now it's got a defunct education system, defunct political system, bad housing. It's got all those kind of things. These are the stories that are being pushed onto the city. And so with Chester Made's help, we've been pushing back, talking about the characters that we want people to know about, our superheroes. We've been pushing back and saying, nah, we know what you heard about it. And we actually don't have to impress you, because I think that's one of the things that bothers me also about changing the narrative, is a lot of times we do it because we're trying to impress somebody. But what's most important is that the people who are telling the story are impressed with themselves and that they are happy with themselves. That's what's most important, that the people themselves can both define and defend what it is that they want the narrative to be. They have to be able to define it, and they have to be able to defend it. And that, again, that's what Chester Made is doing. So regardless of what people outside of Chester are saying, the people inside of Chester are saying, nope, that's not what's going on. All right. I like this graphic. It shows the nonstop narratives and the competing narratives. It's like this highway of all kinds of stuff that's going on. And this, again, is true, and not just Chester, but in many communities, that competing narratives seek to control thinking, behavior, and resources. I heard somebody talking earlier about power, the power of the storytelling. Well, power is a tool that is designed to access resources. And this is, again, what Chester Made is trying to do with the help of Pennsylvania Humanities Council. If we can tell a compelling story and we can prove that the story has integrity with our actions, then we can get certain resources that will allow us to continue to build the reality that we want to see in Chester. Again, you've got to have a compelling story, but you've got to have the actions that show integrity between the story and between the story and the actors, right? If you can do that, then your narrative can be used to access resources. And that's what we're wanting to do in Chester. Dawn, I'm trying to speed this up. I think I'm running out of time here. I want to just go back to this one slide where this used to be the slogan of Chester. This is Delaware County Electric Company, no longer exists, but it was always said that what Chester makes Chester. What Chester makes Chester. That was the slogan. So the question is, well, what does Chester make? And who's to say what's being made? In order to maintain power in a city, in a neighborhood, people have to be able to tell their own stories, not just as a propaganda, promotion, public relations means. It has to be done with the intent of actually building power, accessing resources. Because see, if you keep telling a story and people can look, even the people who live there, they can look and go, oh, that's not true. That's not what we actually see. We hear what you're saying, but that's not actually what we see. You have to be able to continue to build based off the story, use the story to build, access resources, And then that's where the integrity lies. So what Chester used to make, as I mentioned, were ships and cars and trains and all kinds of stuff on that waterfront. That was what, 50 years ago now. They have to figure out a new thing to build. And one of the things that we've been building is the arts community in the city of Chester. We've been building the arts community. We've been resurrecting the songs. We've been resurrecting the poetry. We've been resurrecting the art. That's what we've been doing in the city of Chester. All right, I just want to show this. I'm going to show just a couple more. I'm not going to get through all of them, but this is an important clip right here. So that's a scene on Avenue of the States. This is actually the block. If you look at the bottom of that picture, that's the block where we do most of our work. That is Avenue of the States. And right now, if I showed you that same street, you would see MJ Free, where we do a lot of our work. You would see Kenny Hunt's art gallery. You would see Soul Street Cafe. Those are the things you'd see. But if you look at this picture right here, what you see mostly a bunch of white cats digging the ground and changing the state of that street. The two people above it rarely had access to the work that those people beneath were doing. And when the renovation was done, the two people above couldn't actually even get onto the street and spend time there. So there were different realities that people were experiencing on that same street. And it's important to recognize that. All right, I'm going to start to close it out. I just got one other thing that I want to throw up here. This is one of the events that we did because I had an opportunity to do some work with Lindsay in the past, and reminds me of the work, Lindsay, that we did related to history and asking the question, whose history is it anyway? That was one of our Pulitzer democratizing America, democracy and citizenship, something like that. We did a great presentation where people were asking, whose history is it anyway? And why is that question important? Because that's where the power lies. People are always trying to establish their power based on a story. That's what they're doing. Everybody's always trying to establish their right to resources and their right to knowledge based off of stories. So we understand that, and with Chester May, we want to ensure that everybody's story is respected. And one of the challenges that we can have is the challenge of what difference does the answer make? Because if we could have multiple answers to the same question, and that it didn't mean that somebody in Chester wasn't going to eat if they didn't get the answer right, or they were going to have poor housing if they didn't get the answer right, then you could deal with those answers. Everybody could have different answers. But what it too often means is that if you don't get the answer right, you don't eat. You don't get the answer right, you don't have a job. If you don't get the answer right, you don't have a place to live. So we got to figure out how we can live with parallel stories that are not competing, that everybody can respect. And as I close, I want to say again, it's important for those stories in Chester to emerge out of Chester, and for those stories about Chester to have integrity connected to action that says the story and the action match. Great. This is the work we're doing. This is who we are. We don't have to fake the funk. We are actually who we say we are, and we could care less who you think we are. I'm done, Dawn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If you stop sharing, I'm going to bring up my screen and just start. Ooh, how'd that happen? Okay, start a conversation. One question I have is for Daniel. I know, Daniel, that you have a program called Storytelling Through Dance, and I believe it is in its 5th or 6th year. Am I correct?
5th year, yes.
5th. Oh, I guessed right. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about that program? Because I think it speaks to what everyone has talked about today, using the power of stories to illustrate narratives and history and conversation that is often hidden from the people who are in power and the masses. Can you just give us a little synopsis of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if I'm the one that is reverberating. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So I think that it's important to mention two of the things that were part of the presentation that was framing this. And I think it touches upon leadership development, funding, and partnerships. So we very early on, Barrio partnered up with the Reading Public Library, and we took a look at recreating the library from the outside in, taking the library outside, because the library had found that a lot of people from the community were not coming to the library. And one of the reasons that we found out was because the library is one of the Carnegie buildings, and it looks like a beautiful Greek temple. And if I may, I have a picture here that I forgot to share. So if that's okay with you, I'm going to share a picture of one of the presentations at the library. And what we did was first, we started asking community members what would be some stories that they felt that we needed to address. So the first year, what we did was we told stories of what makes a person decide that Reading is now their home. And as an immigrant in this country, it takes really a process of decision making for you to decide, I am not going back to Peru anymore. I'm not, I'm not going back to Colombia anymore, or Mexico. Now Reading is my home. And so we explored that. The second year, we had a series of community meetings, and people wanted to talk about human trafficking, because there was a huge human trafficking ring that was busted here in Reading, and folks wanted to talk about that. And so the process for us to put these plays together, because that's what it is. We do storytelling through dance, but it's really storytelling through theater, storytelling through dance, storytelling through all of the arts, through writing, through photography. And so we decided that in the writing and in the most important thing, I guess, was the process of the creation, not necessarily the end result, but as a byproduct. As you can see, we have these beautiful, colorful presentations that happen, that take place right in front of the Reading Public Library, that is pictured here. And I think that in the 5 years, what we've learned is that we need to have a change in the way that funding is made available to organizations. Because in the beginning, I mean, when we went and sat down in front of folks and said, yeah, we're a community engagement organizations that utilizes the art in order to look for transformational moments in individuals, so the individuals can transform their own community. People were like, what is that? We were lucky enough to find a local foundation who was very courageous and said, oh yeah, oh, okay, yeah, we see it. And so through the help of this, the Way of Missing Foundation as a local foundation, we have been able to do not only the grant writing process, but also the grant reporting process done on a majority through storytelling. So we send them videos depicting stories of change that happens within the organization. We send them written stories, we send them testimonials of people telling their story about how they found change in the organization. And I think that the leadership development is extremely important for us, because we have a very limited amount of staff. And so the staff that we have, a lot of them are volunteer. And so we need to find ways for our volunteers to be able to lead new and bigger things. So for us to develop them into leaders is extremely important. But I think that one of the things that we have found is that in our community, leadership is, it takes a very specific shape, because people suffer from self-limiting beliefs. So even though they are doing leadership things, like for example, in this picture, the young woman who's holding the red flag, she choreographed this whole piece because she knows how to do color guard. But if you ask her if she's a leader, she will probably pause for a good minute or two, think about it, and then she'll tell you, well, you know, it's a process, and she will not self-select as a leader. And I think that that's it. It's not just her story or her experience, but it's the experience of a lot of folks. And I think that we got really extremely lucky to find partners who said, you know what, yeah, let's go ahead and do it, and let's redefine what storytelling is, what creative placemaking is, and how, or the process in which you're collecting stories and what you're doing with those stories. So the you know, places like the library are extremely important. Places like the Salvation Army are extremely important. The school district is extremely important for the things that we do. So I took the long way to answer your question, Dawn.
That's okay, thank you. And thank you for sharing those photos. I really appreciate it. My next question is going to go to Lindsay. Lindsay, how, now that you've uncovered these fascinating stories basically in your backyard, how are you incorporating these stories in the collection of the Cumberland County Historical Society?
Yeah, so a lot of the stories that we're collecting have become part of a digital archive that is available online. It's called Gardner Digital Library. So if we were given permission to record the stories and to make them public, they've all been put onto this digital archive. And part of the idea behind that is the access, is we want people to be able to hear the stories and learn from them. And then we've also used a lot of the stories to launch several different projects at the Society that help to build some of the collections that we just never gathered in the past. So because we are lacking in a lot of African-American history here at the Society, we're not going to be able to, because it just doesn't exist anymore, add a lot of resources to our collection. So we have to find it through other avenues. So some of the stories that we collected focused very heavily on veterans in the county. And we realized we have over 100 Civil War veterans who were part of the USCT that are all buried here in the county. But there's very little record beyond, you know, recording the fact that there was a veterans headstone, and there's very little information on the veterans themselves. So we launched our USCT project, and we are writing biographies for every single veteran that we've identified. And those biographies is really the first time that their stories have been compiled and will be made publicly available through the digital library. So they can be both an educational resource, but then they also add to our genealogy resources for people who want to try and research their family history. We're going to have these resources compiled. And what I find incredible with this project in particular, and I've worked very heavily with the USCT project, is that there's such a wealth of resources out there that they've just never been gathered. Obituaries tell such phenomenal stories. Some of them are a page long, just telling every aspect of their life. And we're learning about individuals who had been enslaved, that fought in the war, that settled in Carlisle, but were coming from Virginia or Georgia or Maryland, and something brought them to Carlisle. And we may never know what exactly it was, but we can start to tell their story from the point of them arriving in Cumberland County and piece a lot of these things together. So that's becoming a large portion of our collecting. And then we're attempting to do something very similar with Lincoln Cemetery names. The 670 odd people that we've identified, and I say odd because there's some people we think are in there twice because their surnames were listed in different ways. We're not sure if the same person or if it's a different person. But we're attempting to do a biography for each of those individuals as well. Not having headstones on the sites anymore, not having very little interpretation of the site, and then also having very few items in the collection that represent the people who are buried there. One of the things that we talked with the descendants about and we felt that we could do to tell their story is to create a biography. And even if it's as simple as, you know, knowing their house number from the census and being able to show the house or the street that they lived on, it ties that person to the community in a way that they had not been a part of the community in the past. So it's starting to build the identity that had always been here, but we just hadn't told that story before. So we're starting in those ways to start incorporating it into the collection. And then the hope is that we will start to build trust within not just the African-American community, but if you would look at our collections, you would think that no group had been in Cumberland County or settled in Cumberland County past the Greeks in the 1920s. And we know that's not true. We know that there's been settlements of people in this region from Bosniaks to a large Vietnamese refugee population, but we haven't gathered their stories and their history, which means when you go through our museum, there's very little representation of their story in the county. And it's going to take a while to build that trust. And we hope that as we start to incorporate these stories into the wider narrative, we'll start to build our collection as well. But that's not going to happen overnight. So we told one story for a century, over a century, and it's going to take a while to start to rebuild that trust. But we're hoping these little things and working through stories and essentially just listening, asking people to tell their story, listening to the story, and seeing how we can incorporate it into our wider county narrative. We're hoping that'll start to build that trust and it'll grow our collection down the road.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll be looking forward to that. Ulysses, I'm going to go back to you. And, you know, I have the advantage of working with you on Chester Made. And I think to talk about stories, we are just starting a new storytelling project called the Digital Storytelling Project at Chester. Can you share a couple of details on what we're doing and what we're trying to accomplish with that project?
Yeah, and I want to include in my answer, Dawn, reference to what I think I heard Daniel say, as well as a question that I saw on the board regarding leadership organizations using stories to access resources. I think it's important for leaders to be very careful as they represent their communities, not to speak out of turn. I see sometimes people trying to do what they think is the best thing for their communities and often compromising their communities because they become smarter than the people that they are supposed to be representing. And that's never a good thing. And so when we're going after resources, we got to make sure that we're not compromising our community, the people that we represent, by making agreements that the people didn't actually agree to. And so I'm saying that as we're talking about these digital stories, so the digital stories that we're putting together are a great way of collecting those hidden gems that everybody has one great story, if not 100, but everybody's got at least one. And we want to collect those stories in Chester from as many different types of people as possible, asking some very basic questions like, why do you stay in Chester? We're going to take those stories, we're going to put them to audio, 2-3 minute stories with some great pictures that people can enjoy in a very short period of time, post them to our upcoming website, and make them available for people to share and to enjoy. And even with that, Dawn, you know, one of the questions that people are asking is, how do we ensure that those stories that we tell remain our stories? How do we make sure that those stories stay with us and that people don't just take those stories and do whatever they want to do with them? This is important stuff. And I've heard everybody, I think, talk about trust. Trust is very important when it comes to telling stories. You want to feel like I can tell a story and nobody will jump in there with all of the technology and digital stuff we have today, take that and do something different with it and, you know, make it a story that I never told. So what we're launching, I think, can be a beautiful way of bringing a lot of people into the storytelling fold and increasing the power of the community through these stories. And just one last thing about that. I think this is where we also are going to be tested when it comes to the digital side of this, because years ago, you all remember people talking about the digital divide and the challenges that people even have with internet connections in different parts. So what many of us take for granted as we can easily access these stories, we may need to find ways to ensure that the people who are telling the stories can actually see them when they're done.
Oops, I was muted. Yes, thank you. Thank you. The project is just kicking off and it's something that we're excited about, and hope in a short amount of time we'll be able to share it with more people. Julie, I'm going to end the questions with going back to you from almost from where we started. You know, you and your team really spoke with a lot of organizations outside of Philadelphia, outside of Pennsylvania. So you have more of a national perspective. And as you said, everyone has different approaches and different audiences. And when you started this this whole study, this was way before the recent racial and social justice activities that had and protests that have been throughout the country. And just from a national perspective, how do you think that the whole art of storytelling and the whole process of storytelling can be used to advance that cause of racial and social justice in the reckoning in this country?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question and something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm sure others have. But I think some of the themes that we pulled out remain extremely timely and have become even more highlighted. I believe, and I'll mention two of those. The first is the transformation of the way funding is working. You know, just this morning I was on another conversation where institutions, including banks and other funders, are so focused on changing to whom they are giving funds and the themes of that work. And so, you know, the great groups around the table today and others that already have demonstrated capacity and results and leadership and all these things, there's the transformation that we were talking about and wishing for in funding and in organizations a year or 6 months ago, Dawn, that's happening right now, you know, because of the movements that have happened during 2020. So that's a powerful thing to leverage. You know, I also think that, you know, of course, this building power through exchange piece is something that we've all been witnessing, and I think will continue to be supported. But also, on a finer point, you know, a lot of this work has been done by the non-traditional actors, grassroots organizations, non-experts. You know, like the movements that we're speaking about, you know, were all spread through social media, spread through non-traditional media, and it was the most powerful thing that we've seen in generations. And so, you know, that right there is a proof of concept about, like, you know, when there's a seed of a thought and a movement, like the power comes from the people, and it is not necessarily the institutions that are always leading these conversations that are really going to create change. And so, you know, what we've witnessed was on a nationwide, worldwide scale, but those same principles apply to, you know, whose narrative is this? You know, what's the narrative? It's not stagnant. You know, how are we creating power through process? You know, I heard some of the other speakers today talk about the process of the creation, you know, and that power. And so I think, you know, a lot of organizations have already been doing this well, but I think that, you know, those that haven't can learn from the way that, you know, organizations like the people who presented today have been, you know, building power from within and working with, you know, non-traditional groups to really demonstrate that, yeah, you know, we're here, we're determining our own future, and now there's actually, you know, people are truly listening. And so I think this is a moment for the humanities to become involved in even a more obvious way.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Julie. I'm going to actually end on that note. I want to thank all of my panelists, and I personally know of all the great work that you're doing. So please continue. And I want to thank Pam and the people at the PACDC for allowing us to have this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. We've been asked to share our presentations with the organization, and we will all do that. So everyone, have a wonderful, wonderful day, and thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.